Okay, this is lecture 3 of Guelzos Reconstruction, and it's chapter 3. So let's start with me sharing the screen here. Great. Okay, so the events of 1867, which follow along after the 1866 midterm election, which repudiated Andrew Johnson's vision of Reconstruction and validated the radical Republicans' vision of Reconstruction, as people at the ballot box supported radical Reconstruction candidates over Andrew Johnson's picks, results in the Reconstruction Act of 1867. This is the beginning period of what's known as radical or congressional Reconstruction, because now the legislative branch is going to take the lead in this process. So this part of this Reconstruction Act is that it franchises the freedmen population while also simultaneously disenfranchising a portion of the white population. And this leads to a term that, a series of events that historians use the term sometimes a little too loosely, but it's absolutely apt here. And that's a revolution in the South, because we have an entire new South that is in the process of being created. And it's revolutionary. You have, for the first time ever, blacks voting in the South. Some places, this new franchisement and partial disenfranchisement leads to places where there's actually a black voting majority. And of course, they vote overwhelmingly, almost uniformly, for Republicans. Republicans are the party of Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, the party that defeated the Democratic-led South. And so, of course, they're voting Republican. So it's not just a vote at the federal level, voting Republican, or even at the state and local level. It's what that actually means. So you have blacks who are elected as mayors, blacks who are elected as sheriffs, right? So previously, the mechanism of police enforcement was used to keep slaves on the plantation and under the control of the ruling people in the South. Now, the former property, in the eyes of the white Southerners, are now the sheriff or the mayor or other elected positions. They can serve on jury. So a jury of one's peers, which is how the Constitution protects your judicial rights. Your peers now include freedmen, right? So this is truly a radical event in the Reconstruction South. So it's useful to pay attention to not only what we think is revolutionary or what the demands are of various sets of folks. It's important to pay attention to what the freedmen want. And what they want is their own land, right? And so land has two historic properties in American history, particularly earlier 19th century history, but there's still aspects of that that are important. Land is your own economic security, right? If all else goes to hell, you can still feed yourself and your family with what you grow on your land. So owning your own land, a vital source for providing some sort of security and protection. So they want to own their own land, also because that's the American dream at that time, and certainly true today. People owning their own land or owning their own housing or whatever is one of the elements that is frequently chalked up to as being called the American dream. And that's what they wanted as well. They wanted their own land to make their own decisions, right? There's also another component. There's a political component that extends back to the Revolutionary War period and even prior to that during the colonial period, and also extends into the 19th century, although under Andrew Jackson's administration, the reforms made in voting to extend the franchise mostly eliminated this issue about owning property. But property was also the source of your political rights. So if you owned property, you had political rights tied to land ownership historically in American history. So those things are at the root. They want their own land, but there's a problem. It's hard to get land, right? For a number of reasons. First, for obvious reasons, the freedmen had no lifetime savings to draw upon when you're purchasing property. So, their status as slaves and then the devastation of the war left them with only the resources of their own strong backs. And in this destroyed South, strong backs are competing for a very scarce number of jobs. For immediately apparent reasons, no former slave wanted to work on the property of his former owner, right? So one of the things that freedmen population did was that they left the plantation countryside and moved to the cities to look, and towns looking for jobs so that they could make some money. So as you good economists know, when you have an abundance of workers and oversupply of labor competing for a scarce number of jobs, it's going to drive down what you have to pay workers to do that job. So wages and salaries are driven way down in this fierce competition of people whose only asset is their strong back. So it's really difficult for them to acquire jobs, to make money, to save money, to buy property, right? On top of that, money's hard to come by anyway. Good, loyal Confederates turned their gold and silver and Union money into good Confederate money to support the cause. Now Confederate money is worthless, as we saw in the film. Union soldiers were using it on their campfires to boil coffee, right? That had a value, burning Confederate dollars, because aside from that, in 1865, Confederate dollars had no value. We also see in the film Mary Chestnut, in a very memorable phrase, saying that she is exchanging, nobody will accept Confederate currency for eatables. I love that term, eatables. But she can't buy any food with her piles of Confederate currency because people won't honor it. So she's bartering with the clothes she has. And as she states it, she is parting with her raiment in order to barter for food. So daily we are devouring our raiment, our clothes, right? So that also undercuts it. In addition, the banking structure in the South, which was historically weak, right? The major banking facilities came from the North, and banks in the South were regional banks and smaller banks. So the banking system in the South was already undervalued. And then, of course, Sherman and Grant and Sheridan and other folks destroyed many of the physical buildings of banks. So that destruction destroyed the institutions that lend money, right? So money's hard to come by. Second, no white banker or no white person of any means is going to lend money to what they see as their former property to buy their own land, right? So the freedmen population can't get credit, right? Credit is key for buying property. What you need for credit is some sort of thing that is valuable in case you can't make your payments that the bank can take back. So freedmen have few assets, and so they have little ability to acquire money to get land. The avenue that we had seen previously talking about Sherman and his distribution of land to the freedmen population, Andrew Johnson, as part of his May proclamations back in May of 1865, had ordered an end to land distribution. So the land that, the large tracts of land that the nation and the military generals had acquired was by order of Andrew Johnson's vision of Reconstruction. They were prevented from distributing this land to the freedmen population. There were those radical politicians in Washington, D.C., men like Thaddeus Stevens, who pushed for land distribution, taking it from the defeated Confederates, the traitors as they saw it, and distributing it to the loyal freedmen population, folks who had served in the Union Army, for example. But this sentiment was too radical for the U.S. Congress at that time, so those sort of bills and acts were never ratified. So that avenue of land distribution is cut off. And at the root of it is a fundamental problem. The white population who owns land, who are desperate as well, will not sell it to what they consider their former property. So the freedmen population are stuck. They can't acquire their own land. The jobs that they're competing for in the towns and cities. Those jobs are scarce, and they don't pay very well even if they get them. So this is a serious structural problem for labor in the freedmen population. And so we also have the flip side. The landowners themselves have a problem, right? They have some enormous quantities of very fertile land, but the only way to make a profit on it is to have somebody work it, right? They used to have slaves work it, which worked out very well for the plantation owners, not so well for the slaves. But now this has been cut off by the 13th Amendment, which we will see in a bit. The election of freedmen to positions of power throughout the former Confederacy, and the Civil Rights Bill passed by the United States Congress over the veto of Andrew Johnson has swept away the black codes, which also were a method of controlling your labor, forcing people to work on your property. So you have labor, whose asset is their strong back. They can't acquire their own farms, although they want them. Then you have the landowners. Their asset is large tracts of very fertile land, which historically they have used to grow export crops, primarily cotton, but also tobacco and sugar. These export crops are very lucrative, but in order to squeeze that lucrativeness out of the land, you need people to work it. The freedmen population don't want to work for the former landowners, right? So you have a system of struggle. Land and labor are in conflict, or landowners and labor. So this conflict is because neither side is able to compel the other to do what they want. So we have a compromise. It's a true compromise. You know how things are a true compromise when nobody's happy, right? But they can live with it. So a system of labor and property is worked out by the two groups. It takes various formats: sharecropping, crop lien, and tenancy. I'm just going to group them all into sharecropping, and the processes are the same. So how it works out, the laborers want their own land, but they can't get it. And they don't want to come back and work as they did before in gang labor, formerly gang slave labor, but gang labor, right? They want to control their own way they do their labor. So they work out an agreement with the landowners. The landowners need laborers to make this land profitable, right? To start generating some of the money they have lost. So this system is a compromise. The sharecroppers, we'll call it crop lien, tenancy, very similar processes. Sharecroppers come back and they say, we will work on a portion of your property, but we will dictate the terms of our labor, which means you can't come in and compel us to go out and plant or hoe or weed or pick cotton. We will make the decisions about the plot of land that is yours, but we are growing the crop, right? So when this crop is grown and ready to be harvested, we will harvest it and you will take it and sell it, right? This selling will create a pool of money which will be shared between the two of us. I get a share of the crop that is produced, right? So that system is a compromise. The laborers are working on the landowner's property. The laborers do not own that property. They're working on a portion of it, but they control their own labor. They dictate the terms of how they will go about doing it. The landowner gets someone to grow product on his land and a way for him to generate money. But he doesn't command the laborers in the same fashion he did before. He doesn't control them as they did before. That's the compromise. The laborers get to work in their own fashion. The landowner gets somebody to work it. This system is a system of production in a cash-poor society, right? The landowner doesn't have cash, ready cash, to pay his workers every day or every week or every month, right? What he says, when the product is harvested, then we will be able to generate a share of the profits, right? So this system sets up, and nobody's particularly happy about it, but they're willing to compromise on it, right? The vision of the laborers is that this is a temporary thing, that they hope and aspire to owning their own property, that they're going to save up their profits until they have enough to go out and buy their own land, right? That does not come to be how the system works. Not by plan or preconceived development of how it's going to happen, but things that developed over time. The system benefits the landowners because the laborers get mired in a debt structure, right? So this system evolves into one that is very oppressive of the sharecroppers and benefits the landowners. Okay? This system also is one that not only swallows up the freedmen population, miring them in sharecropper status, that extends up until World War II. It also ensnares poor whites who are unable to find their own jobs or property, and so they too end up working on a sharecropper status, right? This system, the risk, the primary amount of risk falls on the sharecroppers, the people doing the work, because in order to grow this product, let's say cotton, the sharecropper has nothing except his strong back, right? So he and his family negotiate with the owner. We'll get, I don't know, let's say a mythical 30% of the crop that is produced. 70% goes to the landowner, 30% goes to the sharecropper. Let's just say that, right? So that payment is in the future, but people need to work and eat and have shelter right now, right? So the sharecroppers have no money. The landowners, the class known as the planter class, they're the people who own the property, not the people who go out and do the work. They're the owners. The planter class, they have greater resources to tide them over, right? So when the sharecropper agrees to this contract, or it's a crop lien or tenancy, whatever the method is, they agree to work until the crop is sold, and then they will have a reckoning paying things off. But in the meantime, well, first they have to put the cotton seeds into the ground, right? So the sharecropper goes in debt to purchase the seeds to put in the ground. He goes into debt to get the tools that are necessary to put it into ground. He goes into debt to purchase the fertilizer to fertilize this very hungry crop, nutrient-hungry crop, cotton, right? So all those things are put on his tab. He has to have some sort of housing, so the landowner rents him a shack, right? That is accumulated as a debt. He and his family have to eat. So we'll talk about later, something like a type of company store, they have to go in and buy, beans or bacon or greens or whatever they're buying, right? So all that stuff is put on the tab. So what that means is during the time that they're working on the property, they are acquiring debts. That will be settled from the final allotment, right? So when the crop sells, the planter comes back and says, I got X number of dollars for the crop, right? Here's your share, 30%, but now we have to start subtracting out what you owe, right? So you owe us rent for the shack, you owe us for the seeds, you owe us for the tools, and subtracting all that stuff, in some cases, the sharecropper actually ended up behind in debt. The crop didn't sell as well, or perhaps some catastrophe happened. Maybe there was a drought or a flood, or the army worm ate up the crop, or the boll weevil damaged the bulbs, right? Whatever it is, if the crop is not produced, the sharecropper's on the hook for those type of things. They accumulate a greater pile of debt. And so the plantation owner, the planter says, okay, you owe me X number of dollars. I know you can't pay it. I'll tell you what, we'll put it on the tab for the next sharecropping. And in that fashion, sharecroppers get mired in a type of debt peonage, right? They can't run away from their debts. That's against the law. And then in a later period down in the Reconstruction South, legislation begins to be passed that makes debt inheritable. So your father owes sharecropper money and he dies in debt. Guess what? As the oldest son, now you have inherited his debt. So now you're taking over the work on the sharecropping. This system was not set up to be a system of oppression, but because the greatest amount of risk falls on the people who are least able to weather it, the sharecroppers, this becomes a system that the planter class is able to use to their own advantage. Land in the South is the key source of wealth, right? This economy prior to the war was economically driven by growing stuff for the export market. That's where the majority of the infrastructure was, and that's where it recovered in the American South. So you have this conflict between the Congress and the executive branch, the legislative branch and the executive branch, in the form of Congress against Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson's opposed to what the Congress and the radical Republicans are doing, so it ends up in this conflict comes to a head in an impeachment trial in which the Congress is charging the executive branch, Andrew Johnson, with committing things that are high crimes and misdemeanors, the terminology of that. Another thing that the radical Republicans were instrumental in getting passed was the amendments. And amendments are absolutely crucial to the thinking of this radical Reconstruction or congressional Reconstruction. Right, now I'm going to explain why in a second. The 13th Amendment is ratified before. Let's take a quick look at the amendments and then we'll come back, right? So the amendments, okay? The 13th Amendment, this is the first time in the Constitution that the word slave or slavery is actually mentioned. It's never officially mentioned. They use euphemisms in the Constitution until slavery is abolished, right? Even though the word slave and slavery is not mentioned in the Constitution is intricately involved in protecting the business of slavery. For you 131 students or folks who had U.S. history up to 1865, that is part of the Great Compromise that allows, that gives the cover for slave states to support the Constitution, right? Is these things that are built into the Constitution to protect the business of slavery. The 13th Amendment, which is passed by Congress in 1865, is ratified at the end of the year of 1865, December 6th. It's a very simple statement. It gets rid of slavery. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to the jurisdiction. It's very clear, it's very tidy, and that's what it does. The 14th Amendment is the amendment that the radical Republicans made part of the requirement for states to petition for readmittance into the Union from the former Confederacy. And it has some key things here that are designed. It's an enormously powerful constitutional amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state in which they reside. This is about settling the issue that was brought forward in a Supreme Court ruling that questioned whether or not slaves could ever be citizens, right? The infamous Dred Scott decision hinged around the idea that it doesn't matter where you take a slave, in a slave-holding state or a free state, because slaves are inherently unable to become free person or free people. That's the crux of the Dred Scott ruling. It's a terrible ruling. This constitutional amendment is designed to fix that, right? all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. So it doesn't matter if you're born into a slave status or if you're born into if you're born to immigrant parents in the United States. If you are born in the United States, you are automatically a citizen of the United States. That's what the 14th Amendment does. A small sidebar about how the Supreme Court functions. The Supreme Court functions as the interpreter of the Constitution, right? So if the Supreme Court ruled that its interpretation in Dred Scott was that slaves can never be equal citizens or never attain citizenship rights, if that's their interpretation of the Constitution, well, this fixes that because now the Constitution says if you are born or naturalized in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States. So now the Supreme Court rules on the constitutionality. That's why this 14th Amendment is part of the Constitution. And it also talks about a particular key phrase, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The due process clause is referred to is one that has proven to be enormously important in understanding the rights, protecting the rights and freedoms of citizens and people within the United States. This is a critical one. I'll talk about its passage in just a few moments and why the radical Republicans did this in the fashion they did. Here is a very brief constitutional amendment as well, the 15th Amendment. And this is to protect the voting rights of the population. And it's written in a particular way, unfortunately. It's written in a way because the people who were crafting this particular constitutional amendment were wanting to make sure that the freedmen population were able to vote, but they didn't want to put any restrictions on their own states as they restricted people they did not want to vote. So California did not want to allow a universal statement of voting rights. They wanted the freedmen population to be able to vote in the former Confederacy, but they didn't want to provide cover for the Chinese to vote in California, right? So a number of states and jurisdictions had their own legislation that prevented people from voting, and so they didn't want to undo that. So they wrote this particular 15th Amendment in this fashion, which unfortunately left the loopholes that allowed to the disenfranchisement of the freedmen population under Jim Crow legislation, and legislation that is not overturned or is not fixed until we get to the Civil Rights Movement, and particularly the Voting Rights Bill passed during the Johnson administration. Okay, so screen sharing. Let's go back to tidying up lecture 3. So why did they focus so much on these constitutional amendments? Well, the radical Republicans were very astute students of how the political world works and how the focus of the nation works. And they identified that they had a window of opportunity, right? These radical Republicans, the people who are crafting this legislation and crafting these constitutional amendments, understand that right now, the nation is clearly focused on protecting the rights of the freedmen. And so they want to install some lasting protections for equality before the law. That is the drive of these constitutional amendments, because a constitutional amendment is hard to get in, right? We've only had one constitutional amendment that gets in that's been gotten out, right? And that is prohibition. The process of amending the Constitution is purposefully difficult, right? Right at that time, the radical Republicans identified that the nation is very concerned about the freedmen population, that they're being treated fairly, that they're getting equality before the law. That is the base level of what the radical Republicans want, equality before the law for all people in this nation. And they want to make it permanent. They can pass legislation, right? And legislation is passed by a simple majority in both houses of Congress and the signature of the president. Or if the president vetoes it, overriding his veto with a 2/3 vote in both houses, right? So that requires a simple majority if the executive is going to sign it, right? Which means that if a new Congress comes in with a new majority, they can pass legislation overturning the previous legislation, again, with a simple majority. It's not as secure if they're installing these rights, but constitutional amendments have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And so it's a difficult process to get something into the Constitution to change it, and to unchange it, you would have to go through the same mechanism. You would have to go through 3/4 of the states overturning it. Because they're astute politicians, they know that the fair state of Pennsylvania is going to vote for the 14th Amendment. They know that Michigan's going to vote for the 14th Amendment. And most states in the union are pretty much, it's a fair bet that they're going to vote for it. But they want to ensure that it gets through quickly. So by making it a requirement for the 11 states of the Confederacy to ratify the 14th Amendment before they can petition for admittance, they're already adding 11 out of the gate. They're already counting on those 11 to ratify this constitutional amendment. They can count on New England, they can count on the states of New England, they can count on Pennsylvania, they can count on Michigan, right? They know that these states are going to ratify it as well. And so combined, this will make absolutely certain that the 14th Amendment is added into the Constitution. And it's crucial for them because they understand this is a golden moment in which the nation is focused on providing and protecting equality, and they want to take full advantage of it. They do pass laws. Federal laws trump state and local laws, as we know, but constitutional amendments trump federal laws. And so getting these things into the Constitution is absolutely crucial because they know that this interest and support for this equality before the law is going to wane. And so they're trying to take advantage of the time they have, and they do in excellent fashion. Okay, that's it for lecture 3. Keep up with your reading, and we will pick up next time.